Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Atlanta Economic Club January webinar. Today's talk is going to cover the 2022 outlook. And we're happy to welcome our guest speaker, Ms. Martha Moore from the American Chemistry Council to touch on some of the key things that she's focusing on headed into this new year. For those of you that have been to our events before, welcome back. For the first time attendees, I hope you enjoy the webinar today. Always welcome to come back for our next event. Just as a brief reminder, please put all questions you may have during today's session in the Q&A section in the webinar, and we'll try to leave around 10 minutes or so at the end for some questions. Before we get started on today's talk, I just wanted to begin by recognizing our 2021-2022 AEC scholarship winners. As many of you know, each year the AEC awards the Joseph K. Heyman Scholarship to an outstanding student in the economics discipline. We solicit applications every year through November, and then our scholarship committee reviews and meets over the following months and then chooses, recommends winners that the board then votes on. This year, as in last year, we have the pleasure of awarding 2 scholarships. So we have one for an undergraduate and one to a graduate student. On the undergraduate side, I just wanted to congratulate Benjamin Harrison, who's a junior working on his BS in economics from Georgia Tech. Benjamin is the president of Tech's Economics Club, and he serves as a senior analyst on the Georgia Tech Student Foundation Investment Committee. After finishing his bachelor's, he plans on pursuing a master's degree in either economics or analytics. Still a little bit of time to decide there, so good luck to you, Benjamin. On the graduate side, I wanted to congratulate Jancy Ling Liu, who is a third-year PhD student, also from Georgia Tech, who has research interests in environmental, behavioral, and experimental economics. Jancy already has an active research agenda with several working papers, and she holds a dual master's degree in both statistics and economics. This summer, Jancy received a fellowship to the Environmental and Energy Economics Summer School at the UC Berkeley Sloan School. After completing her PhD, Jancy plans on pursuing a career in academia, helping to teach the next generation of economic students and pursuing her various research interests. So congratulations again to both of the winners. Many thanks to the scholarship committee for all their hard work reviewing the applications. For those that know me, the AEC scholarship is one of the things that I'm most proud of about our club. And so it's and none of this kind of thing can happen. These kind of things can happen without the work of a lot of people. So thanks to everybody that was involved, and congratulations again to the winners. With that said, I'll turn it over to our Vice President, Mike Skordelis, to introduce today's speaker. Mike.
Thanks, Ibrahim. Good afternoon. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Very lucky to today have Martha Moore, Chief Economist and Managing Director for Economics and Statistics at the American Chemistry Council. Ms. Moore analyzes the impact of various policy initiatives and energy trends on the chemical industry. In addition, she produces forecasts for the economy and the chemical industry, and directs the council's research for direct and indirect economic contributions of both the business of chemistry and the benefit it has for consumers. Ms. Moore has worked on in the chemistry industry for more than 25 years and really is an expert, and so we're very lucky to have her. She has a master's degree in economics from Indiana University and graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's a member of the National Association for Business Economics, of course, which is where we have a great association with her, and the U.S. Association for Energy Economics, and serves on the board of the National Capital Area chapter of USAEE. So lots of stuff there. Martha, thank you for joining us. Very timely topic, of course. Chemicals and everything, including broadly energy, although that's not your focus, is very, very timely, of course, with the inflation dynamic. So please, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael. Really appreciate the introduction there. Happy to join you here from Washington, D.C. For those that don't know the American Chemistry Council, we are the largest trade association in the U.S. representing U.S. chemical manufacturers. So let me go ahead and get my slides up here. Great. So this presentation is our year-end situation and outlook. So twice a year, ACC does a full forecasting exercise for the global economy, the macroeconomy, and the chemical industry. So of course, I put this our forecast to bed literally right before Thanksgiving, and I wake up Friday morning to the news about the Omicron variant. So some of the macro indicators have been freshened up a little bit. We do a survey of forecasters once a month to freshen up the macro outlook, but the themes largely remain the same. I think we can safely say this is still a good version of where we're going. So let's see here. Oops. There we go. So I guess the real theme of this outlook is, this unprecedented adjustment following the 2020 lockdowns. Of course, during the pandemic, everything was closed, and then everything started to open up, and there was this wide surge in demand, especially demand for goods. Right, we were all locked up. We needed to shift our spending patterns. We couldn't spend on services. At the same time, we were getting tons of federal stimulus, monetary stimulus. And there was excess savings. So money not spent on those services accumulated. Some estimates have that as $2.7 trillion of excess savings that accumulated in the economy. Most of that was in the higher earning group of people. But there's a lot of spending, and that spending translated into unprecedented goods demand in 2021. At the same time, we've really seen supply struggling. There were all kinds of issues related to COVID production curtailments in 2020, and now we're seeing with the Omicron variant some labor shortages that are causing production curtailments, not only in the United States, but also in China and Europe and many other parts of the world that are experiencing the Omicron surge. Specific more to our industry, the chemical industry, we had weather-related outages. Back in February of 2021, we had that unprecedented freeze event in Texas that knocked out huge amounts of energy, but also chemical manufacturing capacity in Texas, which is the largest chemical manufacturing state in the US. Then we had Hurricane Ida, which hit at the end of August, also knocking out a lot of chemical manufacturing activity in Louisiana, which is the second largest chemical producing state. So it was a tough year for Gulf Coast producers. At the same time, supply has struggled because of business investment that didn't occur during the pandemic. The labor shortages that we've had ongoing, which have been particularly acute recently, and insufficient transportation capacity. There's been underinvestment in large pieces of our transportation network that has been ongoing even before the pandemic. There are signs that the bottlenecks are starting to ease. We're hearing from the ISM PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, that supplier deliveries component indicates that things are not getting any worse. So perhaps we have peaked there, but it has created a lot of headwinds going into the end of 2021 and into this year. At the same time, we've also got significant inflation pressures in energy and other goods as well, and services, and that's really challenging the recovery. The health crisis has persisted. We had that we're in this fifth wave, I've lost count of Omicron. Omicron continues to hit hard. The national numbers seem to be edging down slightly, but they're still at rates that are 3 times higher than where we were last January during that peak. Hospitalizations and ICU beds in particular are probably the best metric to evaluate the severity of disease. And nationwide hospitalizations are about where they were during the Delta surge. They're just below where they were that first surge that we had in May 2020. So hospitalizations have come up. The ICU beds data has come up. So we're still in the middle of this crisis, and that has really had an impact on the labor market. We were already very short on supply of labor. The JOLTS data from November, quits were at their highest rate ever. Job openings were near record levels, and that was before Omicron. And so Omicron has really taken a big chunk of workers out of the workforce because they're either sick or they're being isolated or quarantined because they've had a close exposure. And for jobs where you're physically required to be that has had an impact and has affected supply chains. I was giving this talk to some folks locally earlier this week, and we were talking about supply chains in the grocery store. So in Washington, D.C., last weekend, you could not find eggs. I had to go to 3 stores to find eggs, and that it was because somewhere in the supply chain, from where they were producing the eggs and packaging the eggs and moving the eggs to a wholesaler, somewhere in that chain to the grocery store, there weren't enough workers because of these COVID related people being sick and not available for work. So having said that, that's sort of setting the stage for 2022. The global economic recovery will continue, but there's a lot of unevenness in the global economy. So it's pretty much the story I've just laid out. We've had vaccination rates, and the outbreak response has been very different across different countries. For example, here in the US, COVID is becoming more endemic, right? With each successive wave of virus, it's become less of an impact on the economy. But that's not necessarily true in other parts of the world. China, for example, the minute they get an outbreak, they shut down. They shut down huge parts of their geography and their economy. Port of Ningbo had an outbreak, and they are shut down. That's one of the largest ports. They'll shut down cities where there's a lot of manufacturing activity or other economic activity. So they've taken a very different zero tolerance approach to COVID. So they are still experiencing a lot of the economic shutdowns related to that, and that is affecting their economy. Globally, the advanced economies we expect to perform relatively better in 2022 compared to 2021. Pre-COVID. Global GDP, we think, rose 5.7% last year. We're looking for 4.4% growth in global GDP. Again, with advanced economies accounting for the larger share of that growth than has been in recent history. We've seen world trade rebound from the pandemic. We think trade expanded 8.5% last year. That would have been higher, save for all of these supply chain disruptions that are ongoing and really across the world. We expect trade to grow another 5% in 2022. Global industrial production rebounded 7.2% last year. We're looking for further gains, 4.2% this year. Turning now to the US, we saw momentum really slow at the end of 2021. We had a really good recovery during the first part of the year, 6.3, 6.7% GDP gains. That slowed in the third quarter because of Delta. There was some momentum at the beginning of the fourth quarter, but that has sort of subsided to some degree as the result of Omicron and these ongoing supply chain disruptions and inflation. We think US GDP will grow 4% this year. Again, that's above trend, and that follows a 5.6% gain last year. Supply chain disruptions, worker shortages will take a toll here in the first quarter. Next year, we're looking for 2.6% growth, so really closer to its long-term average as we recover. Of course, consumer spending is a big part of the story, accounting for 70% of the US economy, as most of you all probably know. Consumer spending was up 8% in 2021, again, for some of those reasons that we talked about earlier, the massive stimulus payments that were going on, the shift in consumption towards goods versus services. People were stuck at home and ordering things online, et cetera. So very, very strong gain in consumer spending in 2021. We expect slower, but still, solid growth in consumer spending this year, 3.8%. Business investment declined substantially during the COVID pandemic. We think it grew 7.6% last year. We're looking for 5.8% growth this year. Getting back on track. And a lot of that is happening in the chemical industry, which I'll get to. And at the end of 2021, the job market has tightened considerably. We are in a very different situation now than we were when we were talking about this a year ago or even over the summer. The unemployment rate is expected to continue to ease into 2022 and 2023. So, we've got strong demand for labor. In the fourth quarter, we only gained, I think it's 363,000 jobs on average, monthly gain in employment, down from more than, I think, 600,000 the previous several quarters. Expecting a rebound in the second, third, and fourth quarters this year. Hopefully, the economy is set to add close to 2 million jobs in 2022. Assuming we can find all the workers to fill those jobs. Unemployment rate continues to ease. So inflation and interest rates, this is of course, getting a lot of attention by several measures. Inflation is running in the United States at their fastest pace since the 1980s. The producer prices were running at almost a 10% annual rate in December. Consumer prices were running at a 7% rate. A lot of that is led by energy. We're starting to see wages pick up. The average hourly wages for production workers was up 5.8% in December. So we're starting to see the wages catch up with that. While the inflation was triggered by these supply chain constraints and excess saving and the strong demand, that whole story, we expect inflation to return to near trends by 2023. There are a couple schools of thought about what's happening with inflation. Again, we're in this unprecedented adjustment. And if you look back in history, right after World War II, there was a big surge in inflation that was temporary in nature because the US economy was undergoing an unprecedented adjustment following the end of World War II. So it's our view that this is the type of situation that we are probably in. Another school of thought thinks that perhaps we're in a situation like where we were in the late 1960s, when there was a sort of a step level change in demand, and the Fed was a little bit slow off the block to tighten, and that set the stage for that wage price spiral that dominated through most of the 1970s and into the 1980s. My view is that that's not where we are. Perhaps there are others on the call. We can discuss that later. I'm not a monetary economist, so I'll just put that out there. The Fed, of course, has quickly reversed its position and is pulling back support. When we were going through this exercise earlier in the year, we expected the Fed to not start raising interest rates until end of 2023 into 2024, and of course we pulled that back. Rate hikes have been signaled that they could begin as early as March 2022. So oil and natural gas, we are closely tied to the energy industry. The chemical manufacturing sector in the United States consumes about 7% of natural gas and a large share of oil as well. We're one of the largest manufacturing consumers of energy. So oil and natural gas are of paramount importance, not only for fuel and power to power these incredibly complex reactions to break hydrocarbons apart and then put them back together again in chemical products that we recognize, but it's the competitive dynamics. It's also the feedstock, right? It's the raw material for a lot of petrochemicals are these hydrocarbons. So we're very, very interested in energy. These are the most recent outlooks from the Energy Information Administration for natural gas on the left and oil on the right. EIA projects that actually 2021 may have been a record year for natural gas production as we have come back. The gray line is the peak, the pre-COVID peak. And so toward the end of that forecast period, the quarterly production will be above that pre-COVID peak, but on an annual basis, it looks like 2021 may have set a record. On the oil side as well, EIA expects that the glut in oversupply of oil that has dominated over the past 18 months or so will be subsiding in the first quarter, and that demand and supply of oil in the US market will be more relatively balanced. So some of the end use markets that we look at for chemicals, vehicles and housing are probably the top two that we look at. There's about $3,000 worth of chemistry in every light vehicle sale. And there's about $12,000 of chemistry in every single family housing start. So these are very important end use markets for chemicals and the materials that chemicals go into, things like plastics and manufactured fibers for textiles, synthetic rubber, things like that. So looking at the vehicle sales, they had started to come back off that $14.5 million unit level in 2020 when auto producers were essentially shut down for 2 months during the lockdowns. We expected this to be a good year coming out of that, but of course they were constrained by supply chains issues, notably with semiconductors, but also some polyurethane foams and some other things that come from our industry that were impacted by the February freeze event. So we're looking, I guess the final numbers came in a couple weeks ago, 14.9 million for light vehicle sales in 2021. We do expect a rebound as some of the supply chain issues do start to get resolved, probably later in the year, but going into a 15.9 million unit year in 2022. In the housing sector, it's been a slightly different trajectory. Lots of demand for housing as people have, reprioritized where they live and how they live. Geographies, the types of housing have all changed, and that has, led to really strong demand for home building. Housing starts rose 1.59 million in 2021, and they're going to expect it to be around that same level into 2022 as housing demand remains relatively strong. Mortgage rates are coming up. There have been huge constraints within the home building sector, labor shortages of materials, getting materials and equipment to job sites. The construction sector has been caught up in that as well. And some of the housing activity that might have occurred in 2021, we think has gotten pushed forward into 2022, which is part of our outlook for another relatively strong year. So these are some of the other end use sectors that we do track. These are major consuming sectors of chemistry. 85% of basic and specialty chemicals are consumed by the industrial sector. These are the industries that I look at, when I'm trying to assess chemical demand. This is a heat map. It is the way to read this is if you look at 2021. The column is from the highest performing sector down to the lowest performing sector. And you can see a real rebound in most of these industries. Last year, almost all of these industries saw decline, some by double digits. And we've seen a rebound of that in 2021, the exception of being oil and gas extraction, which we believe remained lower than it did in 2020. Looking ahead, most of those columns are green. You've got a couple of industries that have always been in structural decline, not always been, have recently been in structural decline. Things like apparel and textiles, which do consume a lot of chemistry in the form of manufactured fibers. And those industries are set to continue to decline for a variety of reasons. Industrial production, we think that rebounded 5.6% last year, and we're expecting another solid gain, 4.3% in 2022. Durable goods manufacturing, we expect to outperform some of the non-durable sectors, and that's part of the business investment story. And this will be included in the slide deck. This is our January 2022 survey of forecasters that we just put together this week. So this is our latest thinking. So now moving to the chemical industry. For those folks perhaps not familiar with this industry, this is a very simplified schematic of where chemical manufacturing fits into the broader economy. We start out with raw materials. Most of our industry is using oil and natural gas based materials, also minerals. Salt, of course, is part of the chlorine chain. You use huge amounts of electricity to split the calcium and the not calcium, chlorine and sodium. So minerals are a big part of this industry as well, and we're seeing that with lithium, right? So a lot of the battery materials, we're part of that supply chain. So the lithium supply chain. Plant, increasingly we're seeing bio-based feedstocks for things. And this is big, especially in places like Brazil, where they're using sugar cane to make ethylene. There is some of that happening in the United States, but Brazil has kind of the dominant share in that bio-based supply chain at the moment. And increasingly recycled content, which I'll talk about a little bit later, how there are new technologies around to take plastic waste and use chemistry to convert it back to its building block materials, which can be used to make new things. So then we've got the chemical industry. So ACC, we use the definition of chemicals excluding pharma. So almost all of our data is NAICS 325, excluding the pharmaceutical sector, because pharma really has its own dynamics. It doesn't really follow the same trajectory as the rest of chemical manufacturing. So we do focus specifically on NAICS 325, excluding pharma, which includes things like agricultural chemicals and consumer products. But ACC's primary interest, if you will, is in specialty chemicals, basic industrial chemicals, and synthetic materials. And these, of course, are consumed by the various sectors, which are then consumed by the final consumer. So not a whole lot of chemistry goes directly from our industry to the final consumer. There's some things you can find on the shelf of Home Depot and in your pharmacy. But the majority of products produced by this industry do flow through to these other sectors first before they get to us. So the outlook for our industry, we had high hopes the previous 2 years, but there were two very weak years of growth in 2019 and 2020. First, because of trade tensions, which affect our industry quite substantially, and then COVID. So we were really looking forward to a good year in 2021. We expected and saw the sharp rebound in end-use consuming sectors, but there were substantial disruptions that occurred in 2021. I mentioned the Winter Storm Uri, they named it, which knocked out production in Texas really for months in some products. Some supply chains were really damaged for a long time. You had this huge area of the country that was hit. A hurricane takes generally a narrow path. It can do a lot of destruction, but it's a generally narrow path. The freeze took out a huge geographic area, and it affected energy supply as well. So, if the chemical plant wasn't necessarily damaged, it couldn't necessarily get water supply restored, or electricity, natural gas, and nitrogen. There's a nitrogen pipeline network in the US Gulf Coast that was damaged, and chemical facilities need nitrogen to operate. So all of those, there was a lot of infrastructure stuff that had to happen before the chemical manufacturers could come online, but there was a lot of damage to those facilities as well. So some supply chains really were disrupted for months. And then we saw Hurricane Ida go after Louisiana at the end of August, which knocked out this chemical production there for several weeks. So at the end of the day, because of these production outages and ongoing supply chain issues, our industry has had no different experience than many others in getting and being able to ship materials. We think chemical production rose by only 1.4%. This is down substantially from what we were thinking earlier in the year. Looking ahead, inventories of chemicals, especially at the wholesale level, remain relatively lean in several segments. There's strong demand continuing from end-use markets. We're seeing improved transportation flows, and those should all be tailwinds to growth. We think the U.S. chemical industry will grow by 4.3% in 2022. And I should add, we've got new production coming online. The energy fundamentals continue to favor U.S. production. I think my next slide, I will walk through that. CapEx continues to expand. The U.S. is still a destination for chemical industry investment because of the shale advantaged, but increasingly we're going to see a larger share of CapEx budgets be devoted to carbon management and advanced recycling activities. Chemical exports set new records in 2021, and we're expecting the surplus chemical industry trade surplus to expand to 31 billion by the end of our forecast horizon in 2025. So this chart here is really the key to understanding U.S. chemical competitiveness. So there are two ways to make olefins. Ethylene is the one that people talk about. There are two main routes to ethylene. One uses natural gas liquids. Ethane is the predominant one there. You could also use naphtha, which is a petroleum product that comes from refineries. In Europe and Asia, they predominantly use naphtha, petroleum product, and the price of naphtha is tied to the global oil price. In the United States, in Canada, in the Middle East, to some degree, the predominant feedstock is those natural gas liquids. And so we look at the relative price of naphtha to the relative price of these natural gas liquids. And those two prices, naphtha is tied to oil. Natural gas liquids are tied more loosely to natural gas prices, which are set regionally as opposed to the global oil price. We use Brent as the international benchmark there. So as a proxy for that petrochemical competitiveness, we look at the ratio of Brent, the price of Brent oil to the price of Henry Hub here in the United States. And my predecessor, Kevin Swift, who used to be the chief economist here, he did a really interesting analysis that when that ratio is above 7, that US petrochemicals are relatively advantaged. When that ratio falls below 7, as it was during much of the 2000s, when the natural gas price was so high relative to oil, that the US industry is less advantaged. So looking at EIA data, looking at futures markets and some of the bank forecasts for these materials, looking at the ratio going forward, it's still going to be a competitive place to make chemicals here in the US. So we did see a more muted rebound from the pandemic recession, certainly compared to some of the other industries that I talked about in the heat map. 1.4% gain in chemicals in 2021. And all sectors did have positive gains, positive contributions to that, with the exception of agricultural chemicals. There were some other things going on there. Looking at 2022 and beyond, we're pretty optimistic for 2022. For the rebound there, 4.3% with basic chemicals. These are basic industrial chemicals, things like petrochemicals, organic intermediates, chloralkali, some of the inorganic chemicals, industrial gases as part of that, to really lead the parade there with growth of 5.1%. And we see solid gains throughout the forecast horizon. So within, so taking a little bit more pinched look here at industrial chemicals and synthetic materials. Again, we saw more muted growth in 2021, looking for much stronger gains in 2022, and then closer to trend growth in 2023. There's a lot of new production coming online this year. So specialty chemicals, these are things like coatings and water treatment chemicals and cosmetic additives and rubber processing aids. It's a whole suite of more specialized chemistries that are very important to the economy. Specialty markets collapsed in 2020 due to the pandemic, down 15%. Rebounding growth this year. Actually, let me back up a second and talk. I'm going to go back over here. Basic chemicals go into things like plastic resins and synthetic rubber and man-made fibers, things like that. The pandemic had a relatively muted impact on basic chemicals and synthetic materials. We saw an actual gain of 0.5% in 2020. And this is because of the role of these materials in the response to COVID-19. While everybody was stuck at home during the lockdowns, there was plastic production, there were production of all kinds of materials, the isopropanol that goes into hand sanitizers, a lot of the PPE, the masks and the gowns and the booties, the surgical booties, those are polypropylene fibers produced by our industry. The barriers, the plastic barriers that you now see everywhere are from our industry, from a variety of different materials. Polymethyl methacrylate is a big one. The face shields, polycarbonate resins. So the chemical industry, the industrial materials and synthetic materials segment of the chemical industry actually fared fairly well during 2020 because of the COVID response. All right, back to specialty chemicals. So we saw rebounding growth in 2021, although that was tempered somewhat because of the winter storm. So materials that were made, these industrial chemicals that were made along the US Gulf Coast are the ingredients into many of these specialty products. And so that supply chain was disrupted by some of those weather events that we talked about, in addition to the other supply chain events that everybody's been dealing with. So specialty chemicals eased, we probably would have been higher growth had the weather events not slowed things down. Looking for growth in 2022 and throughout the forecast horizon. Again, these are very, very closely tied to that heat map that I showed earlier. Remember that 85% of these materials go into those industrial markets. So the employment situation, the industry lost, I think, close to 20,000 jobs in 2020 during the pandemic. In 2021, we think we only regained probably closer to 3,000 now that we're seeing some of the newer numbers. It was a muted response in the employment. Again, we're looking at annual averages of employment. So the weather-related disruptions, you had the largest chemical manufacturing state, large pieces of that offline for several months, and then you had Hurricane Ida. So on an average annual basis, our employment probably only recovered about 3,000, but we're looking for much stronger gains in 2022, looking to add 10,000 jobs. We're looking for the recovery to pre-COVID level in 2023. And again, that assumes we can find the people to fill these positions. Chemical manufacturers, like everyone else, we're scrambling to get workers. It's a very attractive proposition, though, because the average chemical manufacturing worker earned $90,000 in 2020. And it's these high-paying wages. I think that's over 40% above the manufacturing average wage, which supports local communities throughout the country. This is our capital spending outlook. We've seen some really solid gains in the between 2010 and 2019. If you average it out, I can't remember off the top of my head, but very, very strong gains in chemical CapEx because of the shale advantage. Over $200 billion worth of new chemical investments were announced after 2010 to capitalize on that shale advantage because of the abundance of natural gas liquids. Our industry is more competitive in that situation. So there was a huge expansion there. We're starting to see that expansion sort of mature going into our forecast horizon. And I think I mentioned that carbon management projects and advanced recycling projects are taking an increasing share of CapEx budgets. Advanced recycling is, I think I mentioned earlier, the technology to take plastic waste and use pyrolysis, a heat type of reaction, to break apart the plastic molecule into those component building block chemicals that can be reused to make other things. And just really quickly, our trade outlook remains pretty robust. We export about 20% of, roughly 20% of what we make here in the United States. So trade is, tariffs and trade are, of course, very important. We also import a lot of chemicals. So chemical manufacturing is a very integrated, loopy type of industry where we are buying and selling within the industry quite a bit. We import a lot of products that are further processed here in the United States that go into either exports or go into domestic products or sold domestically. So trade both on the import and the export side are important to chemical manufacturers here in the United States. The US has a trade surplus. We contribute positively to the US trade balance, and we see that expanding. And I'm going to wrap up the outlook, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about a recent survey we did of our members about supply chain. But just, with any outlook, there are, of course, risks. These are the things I think that keep me up at night the most. Certainly COVID, our vaccine's going to work. Is there going to be another variant that throws us off? As I said earlier, each successive wave of COVID, we seem to be in a better position to weather. We've all learned how to wear masks on airplanes now. So that's not going to get in the way. I think it's epidemiologists are saying that COVID is here to stay. It's going to be something like seasonal flu. We're just going to have to power through and get through it, which is unfortunate. I think would be better if we could get rid of it, but that may not be the case. And of course, these persistent supply chain constraints. That has really hampered manufacturing, has hampered access to goods. The outlook is for that to improve, perhaps not measurably until closer to the second half of the year. My worry is that things either get worse or it takes a much longer time to improve, because that really is hampering the economy. That ties into inflation. So there is a risk of systemic inflation. Again, the situation we were in the late 1960s, early 70s, versus these temporary supply chain driven price pressures. Trade, I mentioned how important trade is to the industry, not only to our exporters, but also to our importers. Weather events, we had a really rough year as an industry in 2021. Hopefully there will not be any supply shocks or other kind of shocks, cybersecurity, et cetera, this year and going forward. And then, of course, financial volatility, debt in places, especially China. China is a huge, it's the world's largest manufacturing sector. A lot of trade with the U.S. industry goes through China, both on the in and the outside. So what's happening in China is of importance. And of course, any sort of geopolitical risks, which at any given time, there's any number of things that are going on. And then just real quickly, I'm not going to go over this in huge detail, but ACC did a survey of our members. The survey was out in the field, I think, at the end of November through the first week or so of December. And we actually got a very high response rate. I think it was close to 70 companies responded, which is high for surveys that we do of our members. I think we have, you probably know off the top of my head how many ACC members there are, but it's fewer than 200. So we did get a good response rate. And overwhelmingly, supply chain issues are having a large impact on member companies. Delays in receiving raw materials and inputs, delays in shipping to customers. Just about every company has had to make modifications, had to make changes to accommodate, how the supply chain network is not working effectively. And it's not on this slide. We did ask about sort of the monetary impact that these supply chain disruptions we're having to our manufacturers, and it's costing real money. Supply chain and freight transportation disruptions, estimates ranged from $100,000 to $250 million. And again, this was just through the first part of December. Nearly a quarter of the companies that we talked to reported costs in the range of $1 to $3 million. More than a third of the companies reported costs higher than $20 million. So this is real money, and that's affecting that. And here's some information about the different modes. I guess the key point here is that very few companies think that things are getting better. That at the beginning of December, most companies thought that supply chain disruptions were about the same or getting worse. So it's a very stressful situation for our guys. The details of this survey, if anybody's interested, are on the website, americanchemistry.com. I think if you go to the news media area, there's a press release on it and a link to the survey there. And that is my contact information, and I'm happy to answer some questions here. And if anybody wants to continue the conversation, they can reach out to me directly.
Martha, huge thanks. So we got some good stuff and some good questions. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box and we can get to them. As we queue up some more questions, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and take a couple off the top and kind of go through a little bit of a speed round, if you will, just to let you amplify or redirect or clarify a couple of points that you mentioned during your time. Let me start with macro. You mentioned Fed liftoff perhaps in March. What's your view, and what are you talking as far as number for the year of potential Fed hikes?
Yeah, I think we're probably looking at a couple of hikes. I mean, we're seeing, a lot of pressure, the price pressures. I think the Fed is going to want to be on top of that. And, we're certainly seeing that the purchasing, the bond purchases fall off and starting to see the rate hikes. So we could see several rate hikes. I don't know, 2, 3.
Okay.
I would defer to the actual macroeconomists out there on that. But
all right, as one of those, and not a not a chemist, we've got 3 on for the year.
Okay.
I know the bond market has their whatever, they're doing their own ding, but
Okay, great.
right now we've got 3. I've got 3.
Okay.
So a couple others, and you had some really good points. So I just again want to just quickly, the exports, that was an interesting piece. Is the in and out, that integration, are those internal supply chains, or are they intra-company sort of, somebody specializes and does X and then it does Y, or is it like as the auto industry, vehicle production, where it's their internal supply chains? They're sent, something gets done in Mexico, it gets shipped to the US, but they're both GM as a picking on one, or Ford or whomever.
And the answer is both, but there is a lot of the related party trade, I think is how Census classifies it. And I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I think it's close to half of chemical industry imports and exports are between related parties. So a big multinational company, perhaps, in one part of the world, is sending things here to the United States to their affiliate here, and vice versa. But there's also just sort of the specialized nature of some of these chemical operations. You might be making a material that for whatever reason is more competitive to bring in from someplace else, that gets processed into maybe the specialty chemicals or consumer products, things like detergents and shampoos and cosmetics and things like that.
Sure. Great color. Along those lines, you mentioned potentially 10,000 hires and what have you. Would we expect that geographically concentrated along the Gulf Coast, where a lot of production is in the US generally?
Right. Yeah. Most of a big chunk of chemical industry employment is along the U.S. Gulf Coast, because that is where most of the basic materials, basic industrial chemicals and synthetic materials, that's where that part of the industry is concentrated. But there's chemical manufacturing in just about every state. I think every single state has some chemical manufacturing of some form. So there are other states that are also large chemical manufacturing employment. I meant to look up Georgia. There is chemical manufacturing in Georgia, and I neglected to do that before we got on the phone. But
all right,
and Georgia's not a top state, but there's a significant industry there as well.
And certainly transport. So we have a lot of transport that goes through Savannah, the port of Savannah. So
sure, yeah,
it's one of the largest. So there's definitely impact there. But that was one of the questions in the Q&A, was impact from chemical production in Georgia. But okay, you don't know that specifically. That's okay.
Sorry.
That's all right. The other one, and again, great color, $3,000 of value in vehicles generally, domestically. Does that change, or is that same amount for EVs versus a traditional?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. So that is based on an ICE engine. An ICE, heard that the composition, the material composition of an electric vehicle is very different than an ICE. There's about twice as much of polymers and plastics in an EV compared to an ICE vehicle. There's all kinds of chemistry, like battery separators, there's membranes, a lot of different materials that go into the batteries, in addition to the rest of the other components of the car. There's a lot of plastics in the EVs for lightweighting, and we've seen that trend in ICEs as well. There's because about 360 pounds of plastic in an ICE, and that of course would be much larger for an electric vehicle, because the weight of plastic versus alternative materials is such that it makes it a preferred material for lightweighting.
Yeah, well, not to mention most of the interiors are plastic related, whether you're talking about, it's pretty much everything in the interior cabin has some plastic or plastic related or coatings or
Yep, coatings, exactly.
So again, whether we're talking about, again, not choosing one product over another, but Tesla versus the other guy, their interior is an interior much like the others. It's just the drivetrain and other things that are different. But okay, very, very good. Along those lines, so one of the questions was essentially climate change-ish, but the one question was embracing, does the chemical industry essentially embrace the green movement versus as seeing it as a threat to profitability or those sort of things? Again, just from an industry standpoint, not getting too far down the weeds, as friend or foe on the green stuff.
Yeah, so the chemical industry, actually, I get this question a lot. So we're a big consumer of fossil energy, but there's a lot of investment going on to making our industry less reliant on fossil fuels. Certainly for the fuel and power part of it, there's investments in hydrogen to make hydrogen, either blue hydrogen, which is conventional fossil made from fossil fuels with carbon capture and sequestration on one end, or green hydrogen, which is made from renewable materials, and using that to power some of these complex reactions. So there's a lot of activity going on in that space. In addition, the chemical industry is a solution to carbon management in other parts of the economy. So building materials, you've got house insulation and house wrap. You've got the lightweighting in vehicles. You've got plastic packaging, which is requires less fuel to transport. So there are a lot of things, especially in the building and construction sector. UV films that go on your windows to help cooling and heating. Polyurethane foam insulation in your roof, the materials, the advanced roofing materials, and things like that. So, the chemical industry is a big part of the how the rest of the economy is going to come to grips with CO2.
So it almost sounds like it's more balanced or more nuanced than the general, like, oh, chemicals, you guys are going to hate that climate change business. Like, little of both.
Yeah.
So there's some added stuff going on.
For sure.
So along those lines, there was another one that was no, nonetheless, I'll switch gears on that one. So there's one that was agricultural chemicals and what was kind of going on in the ag chemical stuff specific to the pandemic. So there's kind of, obviously there was disruptions and you mentioned some of that, but was there something specific going on in the ag part of the chemical work?
Yeah, to be honest, that is, they're part of the chemical industry, but we focus mostly on the industrial and the synthetic materials and the specialties.
Sure.
But what I do know about the agricultural chemicals is that, during the pandemic, there were supply chains that were disrupted, and that affected the demand for agricultural materials. In addition, you saw the price of natural gas in Europe, really skyrocket, and that impacted a lot of production in that part of the world. I don't know how much it pulled from the U.S., but
and
I don't have a lot of details on that.
Yeah, well, in the U.S., natural gas production is almost entirely domestic, so less. Although exports is something that's
exactly, it's about 10% now. 10% of U.S. natural gas production does leave our shores on LNG tankers.
Yeah, and as it seemingly increasing, so as the rest of the world, including Europe, but also Japan and others, are, whatever you want to say, supply constrained with natural gas, so they're starting to supplement with our LNG being exported.
Very much, yeah, very much. Especially the Europeans right now.
Especially the Europeans, which is, again, leads back to that discussion, although we won't go down that path, but leads back to that discussion of, yes, you can be green, but if you ramp down some things faster than you ramp up others, whether it's alternative fuels, it's not an easy one-to-one relationship.
Right.
So hit that just quickly, like how is the industry viewing that discussion? Because particularly on the the oily side of the E&P world, the exploration and production, even the big, the Exxons, the Chevrons, et cetera, BP, Shell, they are using a chunk of what they had been CapEx is not completely dedicated to just oil or gas. They are now exploring and doing, whether it's renewables and what have you. So they're taking advantage of some of that stuff, which is great, except it's reducing the supply of both of those inputs. Any sort of view from ACC as far as that sort of scenario and how that impacts inputs, kind of looking down the line, not necessarily 2022, but down the line as we progress through that.
Right. I would defer to somebody who's more entrenched in those discussions. But as far as the energy transition is, there's a lot of moving parts to that. So it's not just oil and natural gas and that. It's some of the materials that are going into these new technologies, specifically like batteries and electrification of the U.S. economy. And a lot of those materials, where are they coming from? Cobalt. You need a lot of cobalt to produce an electric vehicle. And places where they're producing cobalt have issues. Congo, and there's child labor issues there. We're becoming increasingly dependent on China for raw materials for the electrification of the economy there. So diversification is probably a good thing. I'd like to see more diversification in some of these other supply chains as well.
Sure. Okay. All right. Along those lines, a little bit shifting though, you talked about production, like production within the basics part, ramping up 5%. The coatings, I think the production looking to increase like 4.5%.
I think
Give a
that's,
little,
yeah.
give a little color. Is that essentially ramping back to where it was pre-pandemic? Or are we talking clearly above to keep up with this demand that you outlined?
Yeah, so I'd have to look at my charts. I think it gets to a pre-COVID level for coatings this year.
Okay.
So coatings, of course, go into a variety of things. There's architectural coatings. That's where you go to Home Depot and you get a can of paint. But it's also these specialty coatings for automotive, and that's where a lot of the coatings guys got hurt this year. So if you're supplying materials to the auto supply chain, then you were disadvantaged to somewhat a degree this year because of the lack of vehicle sales and the lack of vehicle production. At the same time, a lot of those coatings producers require materials that were made in the Gulf Coast that were affected by the hurricanes. And I should mention that the hurricanes and the freeze, going into both of those events, chemical inventories were at relatively low levels because of the rebound from the pandemic and some of those things that we talked about early on. So.
Yeah. So then it's just essentially coming to, or sometime this year, most of the sub industries probably are getting to the pre-pandemic sort of production. So did you alluded to a little bit about increase of capacity. I think that last year, I think you mentioned it was 1.4% ish, but again, general terms directionally, not numbers off the top of your head. Still increasing capacity probably a little bit, or?
Oh, definitely.
Okay.
Definitely. Yeah. There's a lot of shale advantage capacity. So that $200 billion announced since 2010, a lot of that is in the ground. A lot of it's under construction, remaining under construction. Some of that, those construction projects, those big projects come online. We're coming online at the end of last year and into this year. So we're seeing, it takes like 4 or 5 years to build one of these large facilities.
Right.
So some of that production is going to start to come online, either has already come online in the last quarter or so, or coming online this year.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're kind of running up against it. I got one more I'm going to squeeze in here, and it's almost a yes or no question.
Okay.
Chemical industry generally, does it lead the overall economic cycle, or is it a little bit more of a, lag reacting to the economic activity?
Yeah, it definitely leads. So my predecessor, Kevin Swift, did a chemical activity barometer. He actually, it's a fascinating piece of research. He showed that, because of this early position in the supply chain of chemical manufacturing, that you can sort of presage what's going to happen in broader industrial activity by looking at what's happening in the chemical industry. So
Great. Well, and Kevin, who is a friend to the AEC, he spoke to us in 2018. So
okay, very good.
anyway, Martha,
Thanks so
thank you
much.
very much. Everyone, we got a couple more things coming up. We're going to be continuing to focus on inflation as far as programming coming up. February 16th, we have Tim Gill. Tim's chief economist at the American Iron and Steel Institute. So he's, again, big input for a lot of things. Additionally, as we get to March 16th, Iona Mazir, she's with TTX, which supplies a lot of the rail cars and what have you. So really focusing on rail and transportation. So the next couple of months, continuing to focus on some of the inflation inputs. So that's some of the things that people are asking about. You can certainly email us or contact us directly, info@atlantaeconomicsclub.com. If there's other topics and things that you'd like to see in the future, we're pretty much set for the next couple of meetings through the end of the 21-22 season, but certainly for things in the fall of 22 and 2023, which we are starting to talk to and set up now with various speakers. So if there's topics that you'd like to hear about, or things that we haven't touched on, or things you'd like us to talk about again. So we've focused a lot on housing and some other things, but some of these inflation things were definitely top of mind, and things that people wanted to hear about this year. So we're going to continue to focus on that. Appreciate your time today. Have a great one. This video will get posted on the AEC YouTube channel shortly. And again, appreciate your time. Thanks, everyone.